I was here first, son, the old man muttered under his breath, his voice thick with the weight of years and untold stories. The air was thick with the hum of machinery, the quiet whirring of diagnostic screens failing to deliver answers. The A-10 Warthog lay in front of the team, its mighty engine silent, like a beast too proud to roar. The technicians, each one younger than the aircraft they worked on, cursed under their breath, poking and prodding, but nothing worked. The cockpit sat lifeless, unresponsive. "Come on. Damn it," Captain Ryan Hayes muttered, the frustration clear in his voice as he banged his fist against the side of the jet. He stood tall, muscles tensed in the way only someone who had just returned from months of grueling training could. But no matter how hard he tried, the Warthog refused to come back to life. His crew worked alongside him, swearing at the screens, shouting commands, but nothing changed. The Warthog's engine was stubborn, and it didn't care about their advanced technology or their training. The task force needed it up, and it needed it now. A mission hung in the balance, and yet the jet sat silent. The team was losing hope, until the quiet old man stepped forward. Eli Vance. His presence barely registered against the young men working frantically, but when he spoke, it was as if the world paused. "Let me have a look," he said, his voice steady, almost casual, as though this kind of situation was nothing new. "You're wasting your time with all these fancy gadgets. You need to listen to the machine itself." Hayes sneered, a chuckle escaping his lips. "Who are you, Grandpa? This is military tech, not some beat-up relic from the 60s. But the old man, wearing a faded olive jacket and a pair of weathered boots, didn't flinch. He just stared at the machine as if it were an old friend, one who had long since lost its way. The younger men around him rolled their eyes, but they let him do it. He approached the jet, the sound of his boots crunching against the gravel of the runway. Eli's hands, weathered by years of hard labor and war, moved with an eerie precision. He didn't rush. The younger men watched in silence now, the noise of their tools and devices fading into the background. Eli didn't need a screen to tell him what was wrong. He could hear the faint whir of the engine, could feel the tension in the wires. His fingers grazed over the exhaust system, tapping once. He bent down, lifting the panel with the kind of care that suggested he knew something the others didn't. "Here," he said, pointing to a small, seemingly insignificant part of the engine. "This is your problem. You missed it. The fuel line's clogged." Hayes watched, stunned. The rest of the team gathered around, still skeptical. Eli pulled out an old wrench, no more than a relic, and turned the bolt with practiced ease. Within moments, the jet shuddered, and for the first time in hours, it roared to life. The sound was like a lion waking from its sleep, strong and powerful, echoing across the tarmac. The young men stood frozen, staring at the machine they had all failed to restart. Eli didn't say anything more. He just stepped back, wiping his hands on his faded jacket. Hayes, unable to hold back his awe, nodded, his eyes wide with respect. "How did you?" he started but couldn't finish the question. Eli gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "I've been around," he said simply. It was the kind of humility that only comes from years of experience, the kind that cannot be faked or taught. The team stood in silence, their previous arrogance vanishing into the air like the noise that had once filled the space. And as the jet powered up, a quiet understanding passed between them. Eli wasn't just some old man. He was the veteran they never expected to need. And now, they would never forget it. The sound of the A-10's engine was like a blessing to the airmen. As it roared back to life, Captain Hayes took a step back, still processing what had just happened. He looked around at his team, who stood just as frozen, their eyes wide, their mouths shut tight. The machine they had given up on was now humming with power, and the man who had fixed it was nothing like they expected. Eli Vance. To them, he was just an old man, someone who had no business being on this base, but now they saw him for what he truly was, a living legend. Hayes shook his head, still struggling to understand. He turned to Eli, who was standing casually with his hands in his pockets, his expression calm, as if restarting a fighter jet was nothing more than a casual task for him. "How long have you been doing this?" Hayes asked, his voice a mix of respect and curiosity. Eli glanced at him, his pale blue eyes sharp despite his age. "Long enough," was all he said, his voice gravelly but steady. "But you don't need to know how long. What matters is that I know what I'm doing." Hayes nodded, realizing there was no need to probe further. The man had been through things he could never imagine. And as much as he hated to admit it, Eli had just proven his worth. Well, thank you, sir, Hayes finally managed to say. You just saved this mission. Eli gave him a brief nod. It's just what I do. Just don't forget to listen to the machine next time. The team stood quietly for a moment, unsure of how to react. They had spent hours trying to get the A-10 back online, relying on cutting-edge technology, but Eli had done it with nothing more than a wrench and an old veteran's intuition. Hayes felt a twinge of embarrassment. He had led his team with confidence, believing in the power of modern tools and technology, but Eli had shown him that sometimes experience was the greatest tool of all. The rest of the team started to gather around Eli, their skepticism slowly turning into admiration. One of the younger airmen, Private Walker, stepped forward, a sheepish grin on his face. I guess we owe you one, huh? He said, his tone light but sincere. Eli didn't respond with words. Instead, he just gave the airman a nod and a small smile, one that spoke volumes. He didn't need accolades or thanks. His actions had already done the talking. Hayes finally let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He glanced at the now purring A-10 and then back at Eli. The old man was more than just a mechanic. He was a part of something bigger, a piece of history that was never truly gone. General Miller is going to want to hear about this, Hayes muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Eli chuckled softly. Let him. He'll know what it means. As they began to prepare for takeoff, Hayes couldn't help but feel a newfound respect for the man who had just walked into their lives without fanfare or announcement. Eli wasn't just a mechanic. He was a reminder of the past, of the grit and strength that had shaped the very foundations of their military. And as they got ready to fly the A-10 into the sky, Hayes knew one thing for certain. He would never underestimate another veteran again. The team had just finished their pre-flight checks when Captain Hayes pulled Eli aside. The rest of the crew was still buzzing, half expecting the aircraft to fall apart midair, but Hayes had more questions. I have to ask, he began, his tone more respectful now than it had been before. Where did you learn to do all this? Eli looked at him, the lines on his face deep with the years he had lived, his blue eyes steady and unreadable. I learned where it mattered, he said quietly, before turning back to the jet. Hayes was about to ask more when a familiar voice boomed across the tarmac. Captain Hayes. General Miller's voice cut through the noise, and both men turned to face him. Sir, Hayes said, snapping to attention, a reflex from years of service. The general, a tall man in his late 50s with a commanding presence, waved him off. Relax, Captain. I've heard about the miracle worker who got our bird back online. I need a word. Hayes exchanged a glance with Eli, who remained quiet. Of course, sir, Hayes replied, his mind racing. The general approached, his eyes shifting from Hayes to Eli. I've seen you before, he said, his voice softer now. You're the one who helped with the Huey in Vietnam, aren't you? Eli didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gave a small nod, and that was all the confirmation the general needed. The general's face softened with recognition. I should have known, he muttered. You never forget someone who saved your life. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence before the general spoke again. I was just about to call for another team, but looks like you took care of it, Eli. Hayes stood there, caught between confusion and admiration. He'd heard the name, but the full weight of it hadn't hit him until now. Eli Vance wasn't just a mechanic. He was a legend, a man who had earned respect long before he'd ever set foot on this base. I did what had to be done, Eli replied simply, his eyes meeting the general's without a hint of arrogance. General Miller smiled faintly. Well, you're still needed, I see. Glad to have you back. Hayes stood, speechless, watching as Eli exchanged a knowing look with the general. It was a bond that spoke volumes, one forged in the heat of battle and never truly forgotten. We're good to go, Captain, the general continued, his tone returning to business-like precision. Make sure we don't lose this guy again. Hayes nodded. Understood, sir. As the general walked away, Hayes lingered for a moment, still processing everything. Eli had fixed the A-10, but more than that, he had earned the respect of a man who held the kind of authority most people would never reach. You know, Hayes began, turning back to Eli. We could use someone like you around more often. Eli gave a small, dry smile. I'm not here to stay, Captain. but I'll be around when you need me." Hayes watched him walk away, the weight of his words settling in. Eli Vance, the quiet old man who had fixed their jet, had once been part of something far bigger than any of them could understand. And now, as he disappeared into the distance, Hayes realized that the real lesson wasn't just in the repair of an aircraft. It was in the way Eli had reminded them all that experience, honor, and duty were qualities that could never be replaced by technology. The lesson was simple: respect the past, for it was the foundation on which the future stood. The airstrip was quiet now, the hum of the engines replaced by the soft sounds of the morning breeze. The A-10 Warthog had been successfully prepped for its mission, and Captain Hayes stood by the tarmac, his hands in his pockets, looking at the aircraft that moments ago seemed like an impossible challenge. It was running, alive with the power of its engine, all thanks to Eli Vance. The rest of the team was already gathered around the jet, checking their gear and preparing for takeoff, but Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within him. It wasn't just about the jet. It was about Eli, about the kind of man who had come in and solved what seemed unsolvable with nothing more than his experience. Hayes turned as he heard footsteps behind him. It was General Miller, his boots making firm, deliberate steps on the concrete. "You did well, Captain," the general said, his tone even. "But I have to ask, how did you manage to get that thing started in the first place?" Hayes glanced at him, still a little unsure of what to say. "It wasn't me, sir," he admitted, nodding in the direction of Eli, who was standing a few feet away, quietly observing the plane. "It was him, Eli Vance." The general followed Hayes' gaze, and for a brief moment, the corner of his mouth twitched into something that almost resembled a smile. "Vance, huh? I knew that name sounded familiar," he murmured. "He's the one who got the Huey up and running during the war, right?" Hayes nodded. "That's the one. He's a legend, sir. I didn't realize it at first, but now it's clear." General Miller looked back at Eli, his expression softening with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something unspoken. "He's more than a legend," Miller said quietly. "He's the kind of man who never looks for attention. He just does what needs to be done." Hayes turned his attention back to the jet, his thoughts swirling. The way Eli had fixed the A-10, with nothing more than his hands and his decades of experience, was humbling. It wasn't just about mechanical skill, it was the confidence and calm he exuded. The younger airmen had been running around, stressing over the equipment, but Eli had simply walked up, listened to the engine, and knew exactly what to do. It was a kind of quiet power that Hayes hadn't fully understood before. "We've got some work ahead of us," the general continued, his voice steady. "But with Vance around, I think we'll be all right." Hayes glanced at Eli, who gave him a small nod. For a moment, Hayes felt like the weight of everything that had happened was about to settle in. "Sir," he began, hesitating for a second. "What do we do if we need him again?" General Miller looked at Hayes, his gaze hardening. "You make sure you call him. Don't wait for the problem to get worse. People like Vance don't come around often. When they do, you hold on tight. He's a resource you never take for granted." Hayes took, in the general's words, his chest swelling with a newfound understanding. Eli wasn't just a man. He was a bridge to the past, a living reminder of everything the military stood for. Hayes turned and walked toward the rest of his crew, the general at his side. He could already feel the shift within himself. The respect he had for the older generation, for the men and women who had been through it all, was no longer abstract. It was real. As the crew prepared for takeoff, Hayes couldn't help but feel a deep gratitude for the man who had saved the mission without so much as a word. Eli Vance had reminded them all of what it meant to serve, not for recognition, but for something greater. And Hayes vowed that no matter what happened next, he would carry that lesson with him, always. The day was winding down, the sun beginning its slow descent behind the hangars, casting long shadows across the tarmac. The mission had gone smoothly. The A-10 Warthog, thanks to Eli Vance, had completed its sortie and was now parked safely, its engine purring like a satisfied beast. Hayes stood near the jet, watching the crew clean up, their earlier tension now replaced with a sense of accomplishment. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, Hayes found himself unable to fully shake the feeling that something had changed within him. It was more than just the success of the mission. It was the reminder, the realization that experience, the kind of experience Eli had, was something invaluable. As the team filed back into the hangar, Hayes caught a glimpse of Eli, standing off to the side, watching the men work. The older man had done his job, and now, it seemed, he was content to simply observe. Without thinking, Hayes walked over. "You're heading out soon?" Hayes asked, his voice low. Eli looked up, his pale blue eyes sharp, his face etched with years of quiet service. "I'm not much for sticking around," he said. The words simple, but carrying a weight that only someone like Eli could put into such a statement. "I've done my part." Hayes nodded, understanding. The man didn't crave recognition, didn't need the spotlight. He had earned his place in history without ever asking for it. We all appreciate what you did today," Hayes said, his voice trailing off, unsure. Of what else to say? Eli simply nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I just did what needed to be done, Captain. That's all." There was a pause, and Hayes felt an uncomfortable silence settle between them. Finally, he spoke again, his voice tinged with a thought that had been lingering in his mind all day. "I've been thinking, Eli, what do you do now?" The older man's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of something far off in his gaze. "I live, Captain, just like everyone else. But I know when to step in and when to step back." Hayes didn't know what to say to that. The simplicity of the answer left him in awe. "I don't think I could live with that kind of peace," Hayes said, half joking but also half serious. "Not after everything we've been through." Eli chuckled softly, the sound deep and rich, filled with years of stories untold. "It's not about living with peace, son. It's about living with purpose. And knowing that, when the time comes, you'll be ready." Hayes stood there, his gaze fixed on the older man, his respect for Eli growing even more than it had already. He had thought of Eli as just another mechanic, a relic from a past war, but now he saw him for what he truly was, a symbol of resilience, of quiet strength, of a man who had weathered storms most people could never understand. "You ever think about coming back?" Hayes asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Eli shook his head slowly, his smile barely there. "The military's not for me anymore. I've served my time." "So what now?" Hayes asked again, genuinely curious. Eli didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked back at the plane, his eyes far away. "Now," he said after a long moment, "I just make sure people don't forget." Hayes didn't fully understand, but he didn't press it. Some things, he realized, didn't need explaining. They just were. Eli was a man who had lived through it all, a man who had seen things most could only dream of. And now, he was content to let the younger generation take the reins. But the lessons he had left behind would never fade. As Hayes turned to walk back toward the hangar, he felt a sense of finality settle over him. It was a feeling he didn't get often, the feeling of having learned something profound without anyone ever saying a word. Eli had taught him more in one day than most could in a lifetime. And that was a lesson Hayes would carry with him for the rest of his career. The weeks that followed were quiet. The A-10 Warthog flew its missions without incident, and the crew went back to their daily routines, but something had changed. Captain Hayes often found himself thinking about Eli Vance, about the way the old man had handled the impossible with such calm precision. It wasn't just about fixing the plane. It was about his presence, the way he commanded respect without ever asking for it. Hayes was used to seeing heroes in flashy uniforms or on posters, but Eli was different. He wasn't flashy, he didn't make grand speeches, and he certainly didn't seek attention. Yet, there was something about him that was undeniably magnetic. One day, as Hayes was walking across the base, he noticed a small group gathered near the hangar. A few of the younger airmen were standing around, talking in low voices. Hayes made his way over, curious. "What's going on?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. One of the airmen, Private Walker, looked up, a bit sheepish. "You won't believe this, sir," he said, "but Eli's name is on the roster again. They've called him in for another round of training." Hayes frowned. "Training? You sure?" Walker nodded. "Yes, sir. They said something about needing a veteran's touch on a new project. They're bringing in some of the older veterans for a specialized training course." Hayes hesitated, feeling a pang of respect. It made sense. Eli's experience was invaluable. Even if he had stepped away from active duty, there were few who could match his depth of knowledge. "I guess that's good," Hayes said slowly, the realization dawning on him. We could all learn a thing or two from him. As the days passed, the hum of the bass settled back into a familiar rhythm, but for Hayes, there was a new sense of purpose. The old man's lessons were subtle, but they had left an indelible mark. He found himself more focused, more patient with the crew. The respect for the past, the understanding that experience and wisdom couldn't be rushed, was something he now carried with him. The base, too, had changed, even if it wasn't immediately obvious. The younger airmen had begun to approach their work differently. There was more careful consideration, more attention to detail. It was as though the presence of Eli had seeped into the very fabric of the place. Hayes had expected to hear from Eli again, and he wasn't disappointed. It was just another day, the kind of normal day that slipped by unnoticed, when Hayes got a call. "Captain Hayes," the voice on the other end said, calm and steady. "It's Eli. I've been given a project. Something new. I could use a hand." Hayes smiled to himself. "What's the project?" he asked, already knowing the answer would be something extraordinary. "It's about passing on what we know," Eli said simply. "A new generation needs to understand what it means to serve." Hayes thought for a moment, then spoke. "I'm in. When do we start?" There was a pause before Eli's voice came through, almost with a chuckle. "I knew you'd say that. Be ready for tomorrow." Hayes hung up the phone, his heart swelling with pride. The old man was still teaching, still guiding, even if it wasn't in the way most people expected. The next day, Hayes and a small group of airmen met Eli at the hangar, where he was waiting by a dusty old aircraft. "All right," Eli said, his eyes glinting with that familiar wisdom. "Let's get to work." And as they started, Hayes realized this was more than just about teaching mechanics. It was about passing on the spirit of service, the humility of the past, and the strength that came from years of experience. Eli Vance wasn't just fixing planes anymore. He was fixing something deeper, something that ran through the heart of every person who served. Hayes knew that, in the end, it wasn't about the planes, the tools, or the missions. It was about the people. And Eli had taught them all that lesson without ever saying a word. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet routine of the base continued. Captain Hayes, now more than ever, found himself carrying the lessons Eli had unknowingly planted in him. It wasn't just about fixing planes, not anymore. It was about seeing the bigger picture, about understanding that the work they did wasn't just mechanical. It was about preserving the spirit of service. Hayes watched as Eli worked alongside the younger airmen, teaching them in the same quiet way he had taught him. The lessons weren't always about the nuts and bolts of the job, but rather about patience, respect, and the importance of carrying on a legacy. One afternoon, as Hayes stood off to the side, watching Eli instruct a group of airmen on maintenance procedures, he felt a deep sense of pride. The old man, with his worn hands and weathered face, had done something none of them could have done. He had made them see beyond the machines they worked with, beyond the daily grind. He had reminded them that their work had purpose, that it was rooted in something much deeper. "You're not just fixing aircraft," Eli had said one day, looking up from a piece of equipment. "You're keeping a tradition alive. You're honoring everyone who came before you, who worked these machines and fought these battles." Hayes had never fully understood the weight of those words until now. It wasn't just about the mission or the machines. They were a part of something much bigger. Eli wasn't just a mechanic, and neither was Hayes. They were stewards of something far more important. "You ever think about writing a book?" Hayes asked one day, half joking, as he watched Eli run his fingers over an engine. Eli looked up, raising an eyebrow. "A book?" he repeated, as if the idea was foreign to him. "What would I write about?" "About everything," Hayes said with a chuckle. "About your experiences, about the work you've done, the lessons you've learned." Eli shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not much for writing, Captain. I prefer to teach by doing." "You do that pretty well," Hayes replied, his respect for the man growing with each passing day. Eli glanced up at the sky, as if lost in thought for a moment. "It's not about the words, son," he said quietly. "It's about the actions. People remember what you do, not what you say." Hayes nodded, understanding now. He had been so caught up in the logistics of the job, the precision of the work, that he had overlooked the bigger lesson. It wasn't just about getting the planes ready for flight. It was about honoring the legacy of those who had come before, about ensuring that the values of duty, respect, and service were passed on to the next generation. As the days passed, the base became more than just a place where planes were repaired and missions were planned. It became a place where history was honored, where every task, no matter how small, had meaning. The younger airmen started to carry themselves differently, more aware of the legacy they were upholding. Hayes couldn't help but think that, in some small way, Eli had changed them all. One evening, as the sun set behind the hangar, casting long shadows over the tarmac, Hayes found himself standing next to Eli once more, watching the horizon. "You know," Hayes said, his voice thoughtful, "I never really understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than yourself." Eli gave a soft chuckle. "That's something you learned, Captain. When you've been around long enough, you start to realize that it's not just about you. It's about the people who came before and the ones who will come after." Hayes looked at Eli, his heart swelling with a mix of admiration and gratitude. "I get it now," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll make sure we never forget." Eli nodded, a satisfied smile crossing his face. "Good. That's all I ask." And with that, the two of them stood together, silent but connected by something deeper than words, by a shared understanding that what they did mattered, that the legacy of those who served before them would live on, not in plaques or monuments, but in the lives of the people who carried the torch forward. The days began to blur together, the routine of maintenance and training continuing as usual. Captain Hayes had adjusted to the rhythm of base life, but there was a noticeable shift in the air. The younger airmen, who had once been focused solely on technical procedures, now carried themselves with a new sense of purpose. There was more pride in their work, more attention to detail. Hayes couldn't help but wonder if Eli's influence had slowly seeped into the very culture of the base. One morning, after a particularly grueling set of drills, Hayes found himself walking toward the hangar, his mind focused on the next mission. As he approached, he noticed something strange. The door to the hangar was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he could see Eli, working quietly by himself. It wasn't like the usual hustle and bustle that typically filled the hangar. No airmen, no supervisors, just Eli, completely absorbed in his task. Hayes hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open and stepping inside. Eli didn't look up when Hayes entered, his focus entirely on the small engine part he was repairing. "I didn't expect to see you here, sir," Hayes said, his voice breaking the silence. Eli finally looked up, a faint smile crossing his weathered face. "You never know when something will need fixing, Captain," he replied simply, his voice calm and steady. "Even when it looks fine on the outside." Hayes nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the words. It wasn't just about the plane or the engine. It was about the subtle art of observation, the ability to see beyond the surface. Eli had taught him that in ways he could never explain. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Hayes continued, his hands in his pockets. "About living with purpose, not just doing the job." Eli's eyes softened at the mention of those words. "Purpose," he repeated quietly. "It's something you have to find for yourself. But once you do, everything else falls into place. You'll know when it's your time to step in, and you'll know when it's your time to step back." Hayes looked around the hangar, his eyes lingering on the planes, the equipment, the men and women working diligently. It was all part of something bigger, something that Eli had helped him see. "You've been a part of something much bigger than any of us, haven't you?" Hayes said, his voice almost a whisper. Eli didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the workbench, picking up the engine part once more. "We all have our parts to play, Captain," he said quietly. "And that's what matters." Hayes was silent for a long moment, taking in the weight of the words. He had never fully understood what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. But now, he was starting to see it more clearly. It wasn't just about the planes, the missions, or the people. It was about the legacy they all carried, the responsibility to uphold the values that had been passed down to them. "I've been thinking," Hayes said again, his voice low, "about how we carry on this legacy, how we pass it down." Eli paused for a moment, then looked up, his blue eyes meeting Hayes with a knowing glance. "You don't need to worry about that, Captain," he said. "The legacy will carry itself. All you have to do is make sure you're doing your part." Hayes felt a quiet sense of peace settle within him. He didn't have to have all the answers. He just had to keep going, to keep doing his best, and let the legacy unfold on its own. "I'll make sure of it," Hayes said, his voice firm. Eli gave a small nod, his smile returning. "I know you will, son." With that, the two men stood in silence for a while, the hum of the bass echoing softly around them. Hayes felt a deep sense of gratitude toward the old man who had quietly guided him, not through words, but through actions. And as they stood there together, Hayes realized that Eli had done more than fix planes. He had fixed something inside him, something that no training manual or mission briefing could ever teach. And for that, Hayes would always be grateful. It was a crisp morning when Hayes stood by the hangar, watching the sun rise over the tarmac. The base was beginning to stir, airmen walking to and from various duties, their movements swift and purposeful. But for Hayes, the routine felt different now. Eli's lessons still lingered in his mind, like a quiet whisper in the back of his thoughts. He found himself seeing the world around him through a new lens, one shaped by respect for the past and a deeper understanding of his role in the present. As the hours passed, the day unfolded as it always had, with maintenance checks and briefings filling the schedule. But there was a subtle shift, a change that was almost imperceptible to anyone else. But to Hayes, it was glaringly clear. The base felt more connected, more aware of the legacy it carried. He had seen the younger airmen working with a different sense of purpose lately, more focused, more precise. It wasn't that they were working harder, but that they were working smarter. They weren't just going through the motions. They were paying attention to the details, understanding the importance of every task, no matter how small. Hayes had watched it happen gradually. The pride in their work had grown, not because someone had told them to, but because they had learned to respect what they were doing and why they were doing it. And much of that change could be traced back to Eli. One afternoon, as Hayes walked through the hangar, he found himself approaching a familiar face. It was Private Walker, the same young airman who had first spoken to him about Eli's training. Walker was standing by a B-17, inspecting its engines with an intensity Hayes hadn't seen before. "You look different," Hayes said, his tone casual but curious. Walker glanced up, surprised, but then smiled, the pride clear in his eyes. "I guess I've been learning a lot," he said, wiping his hands on his coveralls. "About the work, sure, but also about what it means to keep going, even when it seems like it's not working." Hayes nodded, his chest swelling with a quiet pride. "That's the kind of thing you learn from experience," he said. "From people who've been through it before. People like Eli." Walker's eyes lit up at the mention of Eli's name. "I know, sir. It's like he's taught us more in a few weeks than most of us have learned in months." Hayes paused, watching as Walker turned back to the engine. "It's not just the skills," Hayes said softly. "It's the mindset. Eli's taught us how to be patient, how to listen, how to look at a problem and know when to step back, and when to step in." Walker nodded, taking in the words. "I think I understand now," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Hayes clapped him on the shoulder, then turned toward the door. "Good. Keep that in mind. It's the kind of thing that'll stick with you long after the work is done." As he walked away, Hayes couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. The base was changing, and it was changing because of the lessons Eli had imparted. It wasn't just about fixing machines or flying jets. It was about honoring the past, respecting the sacrifices that had been made before them, and ensuring that the values they carried were passed on. That was the real legacy. Later that afternoon, Hayes met Eli outside the hangar. The old man was standing with his back to the setting sun, his hands resting casually in his pockets. "It's going well," Hayes said, a smile tugging at his lips. "You've made a real impact here." Eli glanced at him, his eyes twinkling with quiet pride. "I didn't do anything special," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "I just showed them what it means to be part of something bigger." Hayes stood beside him, both men silent for a moment as they watched the sun dip lower on the horizon. "You've done more than that," Hayes said, his voice full of admiration. "You've given us a new way to see things." Eli smiled, a simple but knowing smile. "Sometimes, Captain, it's the smallest things that make the biggest difference." And as they stood together, watching the base prepare for another day, Hayes knew that Eli had been right. It wasn't just about the planes, the missions, or the work. It was about the people and the lessons they carried with them. The legacy was in the actions, not the words. And that was something Hayes would never forget.